Schubert's unfinished Eighth Symphony in B minor is one of his most beloved works. Since its premiere, decades after Schubert's death, the fact that it was unfinished has been a great source of displeasure for many musicians and musicologists alike. Dozens of composers, musicologists, and most recently, artificial intelligence have devoted time, energy, and software to completing this piece. I think the main fascination with the work comes from just how good the first two completed movements are. Therefore, how could Schubert abandon something that was turning out so well? So it's understandable that people would hold on to the hope that Schubert might have finished the piece and that by some miracle someday the completed orchestral scores to the third and fourth movements might be found misplaced in some Viennese library or attic. What makes Schubert's Eighth Symphony draw so much attention is that Schubert could have feasibly finished the piece, as it wasn't necessarily his death that prevented him from finishing it, as was the case with Bruckner's Ninth Symphony, Mozart's Requiem, or Mahler's Tenth Symphony. Schubert even wrote a complete Ninth Symphony, so some might find it odd that he would have entirely abandoned his Eighth and then later finished a Ninth Symphony, and then even began working on a Tenth Symphony, all the while never considering putting the final touches on his neglected Eighth. So of course this has led to the speculation that maybe there is a small chance Schubert finished the work, and some theories might point to this piece actually being more finished than unfinished, at least in an abstract sense. Before I entertain the theories as to why the Eighth Symphony might be more finished than unfinished, I'd like to give some background to the work. In 1822, Schubert began working on a grand symphony in B minor. However, in contrast to his previous symphonies, his Eighth would be conceived for a larger orchestra and be decidedly more in the vein of the large symphonies written by Beethoven, as up until the Eighth, Schubert's symphonies were written for salon orchestras and thus less robust in their orchestration. In 1823, after being made an honorary member of the Styrian Music Society, Schubert apparently sent the first two movements, along with at least 2 pages of a fully scored third movement, to his friend and leading member of the society, Anselm Hüttenbrenner, with the intention of dedicating the work to the society to display his gratitude at being made an honorary member. Nonetheless, the symphony remained with Hüttenbrenner for 42 years until he revealed it to a conductor, Johann von Herbeck, in 1865, who would premiere the piece later that year. Not even von Herbeck was satisfied with the piece being incomplete and used the finale from Schubert's Third Symphony in D major to quote-unquote complete the piece. Perhaps he chose the Third Symphony in D major due to it being the relative major to B minor, but it was still an odd choice considering its happy disposition compared to the dramatic nature of the two completed movements of Schubert's Eighth. Nearly 4 decades passed between Schubert's death in 1828 and Hüttenbrenner's decision to finally mention in 1865 that he just so happened to have a symphony fragment of Schubert's lying around among his possessions. I just find this so bizarre. Did he look at the score? For goodness sakes, the second theme from the exposition of the first movement ranks among the great melodies in classical music. The behavior of people is sometimes very strange. Makes you even wonder if Hüttenbrenner had the entire score at some point and misplaced a portion of it. I mean, why would Schubert send only 2 pages of the scherzo? Seems odd to me, but I'm not a musicologist, as there might be more context that I'm missing. But it's discussions and postulations like this that have led to a myriad of theories about the piece. First off, besides the fully scored 30 bars of the third movement or scherzo, amongst Schubert's possessions after his death were found a further 112 bars scored for piano. The scherzo, also in B minor, while somewhat fully realized, gives way to a trio section in G major. This is where the detective work on this piece begins to run dry, as what began as a fully scored movement and subsequently turns into a rather nicely structured piano reduction dwindles down to just one melodic line. This only heightens the mystique of this piece, in my opinion. It's like before our very eyes, this movement step by step is being stripped down to nothing. As glorious as Schubert began this piece, by the time he got to the third movement, the piece has devolved into a singular, incomplete melody in G major. So is this it? Are we doomed to forever wonder how Schubert continued this movement? Its incompleteness is right here for us to see. There's no subtlety in this piano reduction. This piece appears abandoned. Or was it? As late as 1967, more fragments of the scherzo were discovered, so it is entirely possible, in some dusty drawer somewhere, the orchestral score to this movement is sitting waiting to be discovered. So even though the scherzo is incomplete, some musicologists and composers have sought to complete it. Due to the nature of the scherzo and trio form, one can deduce that Actually, around 80% of this movement is in fact structurally complete, as only half the trio is missing. And since in scherzo and trio form the initial scherzo is repeated da capo after the trio, one can offer a fairly convincing and respectful reconstruction of the movement, which was done fairly well by Brian Newbold. So with the educated and convincing completion of the third movement by Brian Newbold, we can now have a 3-movement symphony instead of a 2-movement one. But what of the fourth movement? This is where things get very interesting indeed. There's absolutely no existing evidence written in Schubert's own hand that pinpoints any piece or sketch he was working on to a fourth movement for his B minor symphony. However, in his incidental music for the play Rosamunde, there is a piece that might be out of place. The entr'acte number 1 of the incidental music is a large and dramatic piece written in sonata form in B minor, and even has the same instrumentation as his unfinished symphony. The incidental music to Rosamunde was written around the same time as Schubert would have been working on his unfinished symphony, so it's possible Schubert just repurposed the music for Rosamunde. While some cite the lack of evidence to this theory, which was proposed by Brian Newbold, the same man who reconstructed the third movement, I actually completely buy into his theory. It makes a lot of sense. The piece is written like a symphonic finale, it's in the same key, it has the same instrumentation, and it's written in sonata form, which was next to the rondo form, the typical form with which one ended a symphonic or multi-movement sonata of the classical era. And it's also worth mentioning that B minor was not a commonly used key in Schubert's time. Schubert was also the type of composer to heavily recycle his themes into other pieces, so this theory is entirely probable. However, the entr'acte of Rosamunde's ending in the parallel major of B major seems somewhat too abrupt to me if we're going to entertain the theory that this is the actual finale to the 8th Symphony. While it was common practice in the era to end symphonies written in minor in the parallel major, I find the last 7 measures of this entr'acte in B major too abrupt. In Schubert's 4th Symphony in C minor, the switch to the parallel C major is significantly longer and more fleshed out, which would be the typical way of moving to the parallel major in a significant symphony, especially in the finale. I would almost prefer if these 7 measures just stayed in B minor. Dramatic minor conclusions to multi-movement pieces of the classical period were non-existent, but rare. Maybe Schubert just did a quick and easy change to these final 7 measures to the parallel major to make the piece work as an entr'acte, as I just can't help but feeling this ending would be so much more powerful if it just simply ended in minor. But this is beyond just speculation, as whether the piece is the finale of the 8th is speculative in and of itself. But I completely buy into it. Perhaps I just really want to believe it ties up many of the loose ends to Schubert's 8th, because we then have to consider, if Schubert actually wrote the entire 4th movement, where's the fully scored 3rd movement? I suppose it is possible that it exists and it might someday be discovered, or that it existed and is forever lost, or that the only movement that doesn't exist in entirety is the 3rd, and Schubert completed only the 1st, 2nd, and 4th movement. Whatever the truth is might never be known. But I think Brian Newbold did music history a great favor in proposing the finale might actually be the entr'acte to Rosamunde, as he has given us the single most convincing solution to one of music history's greatest cold cases. There are a few recordings of Schubert's 8th with all 4 movements that were put together by Brian Newbold, and it is perhaps the only completion attempt worth listening to. However, here arises another question. Does the 8th Symphony need to be complete? Should we all rejoice that Brian Newbold figured it out and offered us a completed piece? Some pieces work just fine in their incomplete form, such as Bruckner's 9th, which, although is missing a final movement, still feels as if it says everything it needs to. I unfortunately don't feel this is the case with Schubert's 8th, as the end of the 2nd movement leaves you longing for more. But this incompleteness is also kind of a reflection of the incomplete life of Schubert. We don't have a finished 3rd movement, nor any evidence that the 4th movement is actually the entr'acte from Rosamunde, and it might stay that way. So in a way, is it not more effective this piece remain in its 2-movement form? This has ultimately been the consensus of the musical community, even after Newbold's revelations. And while I commend Newbold's desire to complete the piece, it remains speculative, and all we have for sure are those first two movements. So maybe it's best it stays that way.